It's another Football Friday hangout here in the News OK studios. I'm Jenny Carlson sitting in for Mike Sherman this week, and I'm joined by a chunk of our coverage team for college football. Let's start at his Oklahoma City home with Kyle Fredrickson. Hey, Kyle, what's up?
Not much. It's a small crew today. Let's see if we can pick up the slack for everybody else, huh?
I think we'll continue to power through with Football Friday. Also joining us from his Norman abode, Jason Kersey. Hey, Jason. Jason has frozen himself. There he is. There he is.
I'm here.
Unfrozen in Norman. Hey, what's up? All right, guys. Well, let's get started. Both teams on the road this week, and let's start with OU, Jason. They are the earlier game of the two. They have that 11 o'clock kick up in Ames, Iowa against the Cyclones. But let's start off the field for a second, because the big news going here the last 24 or so hours is Joe Mixon. He reached a plea agreement in his misdemeanor case from that July incident. What do we know at this point about where this case goes moving forward? I mean, the case, I guess, the criminal case is done with. It's over. It's been settled. But what about Joe Mixon moving forward? Is there any reason to believe things have changed in that regard?
No, I think that things pretty much stand as we expected. I think that he's going to be given every opportunity to come back and be part of the team next year, maybe in the spring. And, we'll just have to see. I mean, I think that the public reaction to the video when it's made public is going to be pretty intense. But at the same time, OU did take action against him, and I think pretty stern action. So it'll kind of be interesting to see what happens. But at this point, there's no reason to believe he won't be part of the team next year.
Now, as you've written and as we've talked about in a variety of different places since we got this news on Thursday morning, this was not an admission of guilt, but it was a plea deal to essentially avoid a trial, avoid anything beyond some community service, some fines. He's going to have to take some counseling. But it seems to me, Jason, like this was maybe an attempt for Joe Mixon to just get this behind him. That case would have been, the first day of the spring semester, and it sounded like a lot of teammates would be involved with that case?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what this was. I'm a little surprised it took this long, to be honest. I've always sort of expected that there would be a plea deal, that everybody wants to get this over with, between the university, the football program, the coaches, and then obviously Joe Mixon wants to get this behind him so that he can move forward with his life. And I'm sure, it's probably good for Amelia Molitor, the victim, as well, that this is sort of out of the way now. She doesn't have to testify about it. Like you said, I think that the school and the program probably really wanted there to be a plea agreement, because now their players aren't having to be dragged through a public trial. Several of these players, at least 10 of them, I think, would have had to be called as witnesses. So I think it's good for everyone that this is sort of over with.
Well, let's sort of think about this in terms of everything staying on course. Joe Mixon, still in good academic standing as far as we know. Let's say that continues. Still in good standing in terms of doing what they need him to do off the field, those sorts of things. Project it forward a little bit, Jason, when it comes to on the field. We've seen what Samaje Perine has done this year as a true freshman. We've seen, snippets of Alex Ross, bits of Keith Ford, who's battled injury, but when he's been available, has been really good. Where does Joe Mixon fit in on the field for the Sooners at that running back position as you think about next season?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's going to be the most interesting to watch, especially in the spring, if, like we expect, he'll be with the team, is where does he fit in? Because Samaje Perine has really established himself as the team's workhorse, and then Alex Ross has done well. Keith Ford's going to be coming back from an injury. We expect it this weekend against Iowa State. So, and you also have to remember OU's bringing in a guy named Rodney Anderson in the next recruiting class, who's a big-time prospect from the Houston area. So it's going to be interesting to see where Joe Mixon finds himself, because he's this whole legal situation has really put him behind the eight ball there.
Yeah, definitely will be interesting to see what long-term effects that might have. Who knows? Maybe he's just so talented it doesn't hold him back. Maybe he establishes himself as one of the best, regardless of this year away from football. As we talk about Joe Mixon and his impact, we can also turn and think about another newcomer that has already had impact, and that's Tyreek Hill. Let's turn to OSU for a second. And Kyle, there's obviously great questions about this Oklahoma State offense as they prepare to go play K-State. Right now, the leader in the Big 12, arguably the best team in the Big 12. 7 o'clock, night game there in Manhattan on Saturday. Is Tyreek Hill, as OSU's featured running back, is that a solution to some of these offensive woes for the Cowboys?
Well, if you ask former OSU coach Pat Jones, I think the answer is a resounding yes. He was on radio earlier this week and had talked about his thoughts on watching this Cowboy offense and all the struggles it's had. And Coach Jones makes a pretty good point. He kind of sees this offense as a lot different of a look with Tyreek Hill as that featured running back. He had a career high 14 carries against West Virginia for a little over 75 yards. So nothing that really stands out. But this is also a guy who's also learning to play the position. He's always been a jack of all trades, and through this 2/3 of the season, we really haven't seen that transpire into anything all that special on offense. Now, obviously, we've seen what Tyreek can do in the kick return game and kind of single-handedly won, those games against Iowa State and then Kansas, and that's been so key. But the Cowboys would love to have this guy as a weapon on offense who could bring that consistency. In the past few games, I think we've seen Hill develop as a runner. He hasn't kind of had that knack of just sprinting right towards the sideline and trying to beat a guy out on the edge. At times where we've seen him get pushed out of bounds. So with a little bit of patience, understanding his blocks and making those vertical cuts upfield, he could be very dangerous. And if he can establish himself as a dominant runner, it's going to help the entire offense because teams aren't going to be able to just completely disregard the run against OSU like they have in some of these second halves where OSU has been down and they've just got to keep throwing to get back in games. It's going to force the defenses to adjust to OSU rather than OSU adjusting to defenses. And anytime that you have that edge, it's a big factor in winning games. So I think what we saw was an early start to maybe how the Cowboys want to use Hill moving forward. It's interesting because against Kansas, they didn't have Hill touch the ball as a running back once all game, and now we've kind of seen it flip. So maybe the coordinators and Coach Gundy are starting to figure out the best way to use this guy because as of this point, we really haven't seen his full potential, and that's a shame for this Cowboy offense with how much they've been sputtering lately.
Well, you bring up the fact that he really had a drought as a running back there for a while, hardly used at all, and as you mentioned in Kansas, not at all. When we saw him coming through spring practice, it pretty much appeared like he was for sure going to be coming out of the backfield most, and then something seemed to change. And Kyle, I'm not sure if it was they maybe didn't want to get him hurt, so you limit the touches, make sure he doesn't get worn down. Maybe they didn't like the way he was coming through, waiting on blocks, the patience that he had out of the backfield. Maybe that's evolved, or maybe it was something else. What do you feel like happened when they basically went away from Tyreek Hill as a good option out of the backfield?
It's a good question because you're right. Throughout spring camp, the conversation was, okay, where has Tyreek Hill been practicing? Because we weren't really sure how OSU was going to use this guy because of how versatile he was. And the response we kept getting was, that he was primarily with the running backs. Reasons why they might have gone away with that early in the year, you talk about durability issues. I think they were really worried about the number of touches Tyreek was getting because they weren't necessarily sure how he was going to adapt to the physicality of playing football at this level. And I think so far that he's proven that he's up to that task of all the things that maybe he's struggled with. I'm not sure that's been the issue. Now, he had a few cramps in this past game with it being a little bit hot in Stillwater this past Saturday, but that's really been it. And I think another part of it it is, they have a lot of respect for Desmond Rowland. He's a senior, so to kind of make Hill your featured back, you're taking away carries from a guy who's proven in this offense, who's put up stats in the past. But with this offensive line and the struggles they've been having, I mean, it's pretty clear that Desmond Rowland right now might not be the answer as far as who the best back can be with the collection of players that are on this offense. So it'll be interesting to see if this trend continues, if maybe the OSU just likes some matchups it saw against West Virginia. They really haven't pointed toward whether or not Tyreek Hill is going to be that featured back moving forward. But gosh, if you can have him touching the ball, a ton of times on offense, it's going to keep the defense wondering where he's going to go. It's going to keep them on their heels. Because to this point, I think teams have scouted him pretty well, and that's kind of been put a limit on the success that Tyreek's had on offense.
Yeah, definitely so. And by the way, you mentioned that heat that was last week during that West Virginia game, over 90 degrees, affected everybody because it felt like an August day in October. Nobody's going to have to worry about that in Manhattan, Kyle. I think the highs are in the 50s, and with a 7 o'clock kick, it'll probably be in the 40s or 30s by the time that game's over. Cramps should not be a problem on Saturday night.
You're right, and if it's that cold, you wonder how it affects how the offense is run. This is a young team that hasn't played in these types of conditions. The ball's going to be a lot harder to catch, especially if Dax is out there slinging it. He has a lot of arm strength. Is that going to affect the hands of the wide receivers? I mean, it's a lot to be seen, but it's definitely a factor that you got to look at when looking at this game.
Yeah, even farther north is where the Sooners will be, but with a day game, probably won't be quite as cold in Ames as it will be in Manhattan. Obviously, that's something I'm sure that Jason will be mindful of as he's packing his bags. But Jason, something else that I think folks from Norman will be interested in is the guy that's calling plays up at Iowa State, Mark Mangino, who obviously Sooner fans know well as the offensive coordinator through those early 2000s and the great runs that those Sooner teams had. Then he goes to Kansas. Is on the outs there, was out of coaching for a while, now is at Iowa State. Jason, you got a chance to talk to Coach Mangino. How does he feel back in coaching and back on the sidelines back in college football?
Well, I think he's excited to be back in it. This was a tough transition for him. Obviously, like you said, I mean, OU fans know him as the coordinator who was, calling plays when OU won the national championship in 2000, and obviously goes to Kansas and has just remarkable success, including a 12-1 year and an Orange Bowl victory, which seems incredible today with all the struggles Kansas has had. That Mark Mangino was able to accomplish that there. So obviously the way things ended there weren't pretty in a lot of ways. There was a lot of really nasty allegations, and I think that Mark has acknowledged that he probably went too far at times and spent a few years sort of getting things back into perspective for himself. I think, his wife was battling breast cancer. I wrote about that a couple of years ago, and I think that that sort of gave him a pretty solid perspective that football certainly is not life or death. And then he went to Youngstown State for a year. That's his alma mater. He's an assistant coach there in small-time college football. And that sort of gave him a chance to have some fun, to go back home, be around family. He said that it was like going back to college for him. And so, and then obviously the Iowa State job opens up, and he took it. And he's done a great job so far. I mean, Iowa State has not won a lot of games, but they've made clear improvements, especially on offense. You look at, they scored 45 points against Texas, a defense that stifled OU completely. And then Sam Richardson at quarterback was wildly inconsistent last year, and this year he looks like a different player. So Mark Mangino's clearly had a major impact there, and I think that it'll be interesting to see what he's able to do against his old team.
Yeah, we'll talk more about how this game might play out in a second. But, Jason, as we talk about Mark Mangino, I think a lot of people around here might be wondering, is this a step that Mark Mangino takes to then become a coach again, a head coach again? Could he potentially be in line for a job someday? He seems to do really well at, building programs that maybe are, mid to lower tier. You talk about Kansas 12-1 and an Orange Bowl victory, and just what a remarkable job he did there. Clearly did fantastic things in that regard, but with some blemishes, some questions, and his departure. Is he trying to rebuild a resume to be a head coach again, or does he see himself continuing in an offensive coordinator role? You're writing about him for our OU pregame on this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that he's made any secret about the fact that I think he would like to be a head coach again. But right now, just talking to him, it seems like he's very content right now. I think he and his wife really like it in Ames. It's a nice city for him. His son, Tommy Mangino, is a wide receivers coach for the Cyclones right now, so he's able to spend a whole lot more time around him and his kids. So, right now, I think that if something was to open up and he was to get an offer, I'm not saying he would say no. I think that he'd strongly consider it. And I think that, I do think that ultimately that's where he'd like to get to again. But right now, I don't think that's anything that's really on his mind all that much. I think that he's very happy where he's at.
I got to tell you, Jason, a program like an SMU that already has parted ways, June Jones leaving midstream. I mean, that's the type of program in my mind. Mark Mangino coaches a lot of the same ways I think Bill Snyder does. He gets the best out of guys, goes and finds recruits that maybe aren't the top-end recruits but can play. I mean, you look at the guys that Mark Mangino had on some of those Kansas teams. A guy like Chris Harris comes to mind, who plays a pretty big role for the Denver Broncos now, came out of Bixby, Oklahoma, local in-state guy here that they got up to Kansas that became mainstay of their defense and became a great NFL player. I mean, a program like that, I could see. I don't know who's going to take the chance because of the way Mark Mangino left Kansas, but if you're looking to build a program, he might be a guy that an SMU type of program might look at. I don't know who's out there, but you never know who could come knocking on the door for Mark Mangino, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see him as a guy who's going to go to Michigan or Florida or any of the those kind of jobs that are going to come open, or we think are going to come open. But yeah, I mean, I think SMU would be an interesting place. I think certainly places like that are where he would seem to fit well. A couple of years ago, in 2012, after that season, this was before he even went back to Youngstown State, he was sort of tossed. His name was tossed around a little bit for the Colorado job that had just come open. They haven't really done much since then, so maybe they should have gone in that direction. But he's a great coach. There's no question about that. But you're right. I think that the baggage that he might bring, just because of the allegations and that came up against him when he left Kansas, I think is going to be a problem. Because it's unfortunate, but I think that a lot of opposing coaches probably would try to use that in recruiting against him. And I think that athletic directors sort of have to be mindful of that, whether it's fair or not.
Right. And let's remember, about the same time, we saw Mike Leach get booted from Texas Tech for some somewhat similar type things. He now is at Washington State, obviously a head coach, has been. They took a chance. You got to think there's somebody out there that might want to build their program under Mark Mangino. He'll be the focus of our OU pregame on Saturday. Our OSU pregame, Kyle is going to focus in on all of these underclassmen, Kyle, that OSU it has been forced to use, the lack of depth really across the board. I mean, we've seen it sort of highlighted in some spots, but it's really at a lot of different positions. And the question is out there, what all caused this? And does it have some roots in some busts on the recruiting trail going back into 2010, 2011? Does that play into what we're seeing today?
Absolutely, and that's been the thing with this year. It's Mike Gundy keeps commenting on they don't have the depth. They have a ton of young guys who've been forced into starting roles, and how that happens is attrition. The layers in between starters start to disappear, and when that happens, there's just these big gaps in times where these young guys have to step up, and a lot of that does point back to a couple recruiting classes that were at this point have to be seen as big time busts. If you look at 2011, that class of 27 players that OSU brought in, there's only 18 of those guys left. You go back one more class in 2010, another class of 27 guys, only 10 players left from that rank. So a lot of that, it comes down to some disciplinary problems. It comes down to guys who transfer, recruits that just don't pan out. It's going to happen in every class. But it's no doubt had an impact on this OSU team when you look at where they're at now. And then when you pile up on top of that, just some of the bad luck they've had with injuries and then guys who've just departed for other places. When we talk about the offensive line, the issues they have there, and then Devin Davis, would be their best offensive lineman this year, is out with an injury. It just all adds up and is part of a bigger puzzle to really explain what's happened this season. Well, and, I think that might play into why Mike Gundy has kind of been just calm and collective through all this, because there's no point in freaking out about something that's kind of already run its course. This is the team that they're set up with, and then this is what they're going to have to live with.
Well, and, you talk about the recruiting classes that haven't been good, and yet, you think about that senior class of last year and how big and talented they were, a group that was really had fingerprints all over, offense, defense, really was a huge part of the Cowboys for several seasons. And I wonder, too, if that had anything to do with some of the problems that followed them, in that those guys were playing, they were taking playing time. Guys were saying, I don't know if I want to sit here for 2-3 years before I ever even maybe get a chance. That really good class, did it have an impact on what we've seen come down the pipe with this team?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about 28 guys, 28 seniors who departed from this last class. And really it was, one of the most talented and most well-decorated classes among the history of the program. We're talking about the winningest teams that the Cowboys have ever had. Those were the guys who were prominently featured. But there's a flip side to that as well. Those are 28 guys who are extremely well liked and well respected in the locker room. They led this team to so much success. And who better to have for a role model for a lot of these younger guys who had to come up beneath them? So, they departed the program, but behind them, I think they left a winning tradition that these young players really understand and that they're no doubt trying to live up to. So, I think when we look for silver linings and kind of how everything shook out, that's got to be one of the main ones, because they set the standard of how things should be at Oklahoma State, and now it's up to these young guys to figure it out to get back to that level where they once were.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, like you say, are looking for answers, and maybe Mike Gundy and some of his other coaches saw the handwriting on the wall and knew this was coming, and everybody else is just finally coming to grips with what they've been dealing with. So lots of great stuff coming in our OSU pregame as well as our OU pregame. Jason Kersey had to drop off the hangout, but let's finish up, Kyle, by talking about these potential road upsets. Two teams that are trying to score upsets, that being Oklahoma State at K-State, but then Iowa State would be trying to upset the Sooners there in Ames. And I'm kind of curious from the Oklahoma State perspective, what would need to happen for the Cowboys to go to Manhattan to score the upset? We've seen some weird things happen with OSU when they go to Manhattan. Top of my mind is 2 years ago when all of a sudden Clint Shelf's playing quarterback for the Cowboys. We thought he was third string, and all of a sudden he's playing against one of the best teams in the country at that point, Colin Klein and company, playing for K-State. So some weird things have happened in Manhattan, but what could happen for the Cowboys to score what would be a big upset on the road?
I think when we look at all the factors that have gone into OSU's decline, those things have to get shirt out in this game, and it starts with a fast start. This is a team that has sputtered in the first quarter of games this year. Over the course of the year, they've been outscored 68-44 in the first quarter. Dax Garman has 4 interceptions in the last 5 starts in the first quarter as well. So you get into a hole and then you're fighting back the whole game. That's just not a good recipe for success with such a young team. So OSU needs to get on the board early. They've got to put a little bit of pressure on Kansas State to play to them. Like I had said earlier, OSU keeps getting in a position where they're in an early hole, and then defenses just remain aggressive against them and kind of make OSU play to them. If OSU can get out in the forefront of this game, kind of establish a tone early, that's definitely going to help. But we're talking about a Kansas State team that's not going to do them any favors. With Bill Snyder, we always have come to expect a team that's not going to beat itself, and that rings true again this year. They're third in the nation as far as penalties per game go. That they're under 4 a game right now, which is definitely impressive. Quarterback Jake Waters is completing somewhere around 65% of his passes. So you have to play a sound game and limit your own mistakes, because Kansas State isn't going to make any of their own usually, to decide an outcome. But like you mentioned, OSU not having a lot of success in Manhattan recently. I think they're 1-7 since the early 90s. You talk about Lunt going out in that game. Beyond that, they've had a lot of weird things happen. Back in the early 2000s in the Les Miles era, their starting running back and their starting fullback both got hurt on the same play and were out for the whole game. So it matches up well with this Halloween weekend, because it's been nothing but spooky times for the Cowboys every time that they've played in Manhattan for a long time now.
Yeah, and it's interesting, sort of on the flip side of that, with Oklahoma going to Iowa State, a place that the Sooners haven't lost in several decades, and yet Iowa State, a place that Cowboy fans and lots of other teams know can be a house of horrors. Almost unexpectedly, OSU going up there a couple years ago with that fantastic Brandon Weeden, Justin Blackman-led team, and losing on a Friday night to Iowa State, very unexpected. So Iowa State definitely capable. Seeing them score 45 points a couple weeks ago against Texas, I think, has to be an eye-opener for the Sooners. But in my mind, if you're talking about what would Iowa State need to do to score that home upset as they welcome Oklahoma up there to Ames, I think it has to start on defense. We've seen teams decide that they're going to force Trevor Knight and his arm to beat them. I think that's what Iowa State will probably try to do, load up the box, limit the run. Paul Rhodes, a defensive guy who definitely brings a solid scheme to most games. He may be outmanned, but he's very rarely outcoached, so I think he'll come in with a good, solid scheme against Oklahoma, and I think he'll try, like other teams have done, try to have Trevor Knight and his arm be the difference. Now, we did see Trevor Knight had a fantastic game against Kansas State. That one throw notwithstanding, obviously a huge mistake on his part to throw that pick six, but if they can ride that momentum wave and have Trevor Knight have another big game with his arm, I think that they can really run away from Iowa State. It remains to be seen if that consistency is coming for Trevor Knight or not. But I do think that's where Oklahoma is probably going to have to establish itself, is get the pass game going, because they've got superior athletes. I think that's where they have a big advantage over Iowa State, but they're going to have to be solid in both phases of that offense to get going against Paul Rhodes and that defense. And Kyle, that last question will go to you when we talk about areas of vulnerability. Where is K-State vulnerable? Where could Oklahoma potentially find some soft spots in that Wildcat team on Saturday night?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, they're solid across the board, but when you look at this K-State team and how OSU is built, you got to figure that Tyreek Hill is your wild card. If he can get a big return in either the punt or the kicking game, it's going to shift momentum and going to really help an OSU team that's sputtered on offense. So, you get the big return going, you get the momentum early. I think those are the things that will lead to success for OSU. But we're talking about a team that just has not figured itself out offensively, and a Kansas State defense that shut out Texas, 23-0. The first time Texas had been shut out like that since 2004 when they lost to OU. So it's a huge challenge for the Cowboys, and there's, it does not look like things are going to be in their favor. Favorite, Vegas has them as a 12.5-point dog, and I think that might even be a little, nice to the Cowboys in a lot of sense, just considering the lack of success they've had on offense. So definitely going to be a challenge for the Cowboys in Manhattan.
I think the good thing for the Cowboys is that the Wildcats don't usually blow anybody out. So They'll probably be in the game. Whether they can get any traction and ever get over the hump remains to be seen. Again, Oklahoma at Iowa State, 11 a.m. on Saturday. Oklahoma State at Kansas State at 7 p.m. on Saturday. Lots of great football on your Saturday. But thanks for joining us on the Football Friday Hangout. Be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.